My neighbor left a note on my door at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and it said 4 words: "Don't come home tomorrow." No signature. No explanation. Just those 4 words written in shaky blue ink on the back of a grocery receipt. I stood in my hallway holding that note for a long time, the kind of long where you read the same 4 words over and over hoping they'll rearrange themselves into something that makes sense. They didn't. I'd lived in that house for 2 years. It was a small rental on a quiet street in Greenville, South Carolina. The kind of neighborhood where people still mow their own lawns on Saturday mornings and wave at you from their driveways. My next-door neighbor was a man in his late 60s named Walter. Wait, no. I need to use a different name. His name was Clint. Retired schoolteacher, always wore a baseball cap, kept a wind chime on his porch that drove me mildly crazy every time a storm rolled through. We were friendly in that polite, wave and nod kind of way. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times in 2 years. He brought over tomatoes from his garden once. I gave him a plate of Christmas cookies once. That was the extent of our relationship, so when I turned that note over in my hands and recognized his handwriting, I'd seen it on a birthday card he'd left with the tomatoes once. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. Pure, total confusion. My second thought was, is this man losing his mind? I almost threw the note away. I really did. I stood over my kitchen trash can for a solid 30 seconds and then something stopped me. I don't know what. Call it instinct, call it paranoia, call it whatever you want. I folded the note and put it in the drawer next to my bed instead. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about those 4 words. Don't come home tomorrow. Not be careful. Not something's going on. Not even a name, a reason, a context, just that. And the more I stared at my ceiling in the dark, the more it felt less like the ramblings of a confused old man and more like a warning from someone who knew something I didn't. I got up at 6 the next morning anyway. I had work. I'm a dental hygienist and I had a full schedule. 8 patients, no gaps, and my office manager already hated when I called out. I showered, made coffee, fed my cat, Pepper. She's a fat orange tabby who thinks she owns every surface in the house. And I drove to work like a completely normal person. But I thought about that note the whole drive in. By noon, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Clint was getting older. Maybe he'd meant to write it to someone else and slipped it under my door by mistake. Maybe it was some kind of inside joke I wasn't in on. People in their late 60s do eccentric things sometimes. My grandmother used to leave voicemails for herself on her own phone and then panic when she heard them back. I ate lunch at my desk and scrolled through my phone and felt almost embarrassed for how seriously I'd taken 4 words on a grocery receipt. Then my coworker knocked on my break room door and said, "Hey, isn't your street Pembroke Lane? There's something on the news." I remembered the specific feeling of my coffee cup going still in my hand. I looked up the story on my phone. It was brief. A local news blurb, the kind they post at noon before they have the full picture. All it said was that there had been a police incident on Pembroke Lane that morning around 9 o'clock and that 1 person had been taken into custody. No names. No details. Crime reporter stuff. Vague on purpose. My hands were shaking a little when I called the non-emergency line. The officer who answered was patient with me. She took down my name and address and put me on a brief hold. And when she came back, she said, in the careful, measured tone of someone trained to deliver information without alarming people, that there had been an incident at a property 2 houses down from mine. She couldn't give me details over the phone, but she said I could speak with the detective handling the case if I wanted more information, and that it would be fine for me to return home. I sat in that break room for 10 more minutes after I hung up. My coworker stood in the doorway looking at me with that specific look people have when they want to ask if you're okay, but can sense the answer is no. "I'm fine," I told her. "I just need a minute." I finished my last 3 patients on autopilot. I remember almost nothing about that afternoon except that I kept making small errors. using the wrong size mirror, mixing up which tray belonged to which room, and one patient asked me if I was feeling all right, and I said yes with a smile so practiced it felt like a mask. I drove home the long way. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was stalling. Pembroke Lane looked completely normal when I turned onto it. That was almost the strangest part. 2 houses down from mine, there was a single strip of yellow police tape across the front walk, but the house itself was still. No cruisers, no crowds, just tape. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment. Clint was on his porch. He was sitting in his usual chair with a mug in his hands, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him look. Not frail, exactly. More like tired in a very deep way. When he saw my car pull in, he stood up slowly and walked to the edge of his porch and raised a hand. I got out of my car. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question. It was relief. "What happened?" I asked. He looked down at his mug for a moment, then back at me. "Come sit down," he said. "I'll tell you what I know." I sat in the second chair on his porch, the one that usually had a stack of old Field and Stream magazines on it that he moved without comment. And he told me the story slowly, the way older people sometimes do when they're being careful to get details right. He'd noticed something about 2 weeks ago. A car he didn't recognize parked on the street. Not unusual in itself, but it kept coming back. Same car, different times of day, always positioned to have a clear sightline to my house. He didn't want to say anything to me because he wasn't sure. He said, "I didn't want to scare you if it was nothing. You know how neighborhoods are. Sometimes people have reasons." He'd written down the license plate. He'd called the non-emergency line himself a week ago, and they'd said they'd look into it. He didn't hear back. Then 3 days ago, the car was there again, and this time Clint said he'd seen the driver get out and walk slowly along the side fence of the empty house between ours, looking toward my backyard. That was when he'd written the note. "I didn't want to knock," he told me. "It was late and I thought if he was watching your house and he saw me come over, it might make things worse." He looked at me steadily. "I should have done more." "I'm sorry I didn't do more. I'm sorry I didn't do more." I didn't know what to say to that. My throat felt strange. That morning, around 8:30, Clint had seen the car again. He'd called 911 that time, not the non-emergency line, 911, and told them exactly what he'd seen over the past 2 weeks. Officers had arrived within 20 minutes. The man had still been parked on the street. When they ran his plates, they found an active restraining order against him, not connected to me, connected to a woman who had previously rented my house. She'd moved out over a year before I moved in. He apparently didn't know that, or didn't care. They took him in. I sat on Clint's porch for a long time after he finished talking. Pepper had gotten out through the cat door. She does this sometimes, goes on her own little patrol of the front yard, and she was sitting primly in my driveway, watching us like she'd understood everything. "I didn't know," I finally said, "about the woman who lived there before me." "Most people don't know those things when they move in," Clint said. He wasn't saying it to make me feel better, just as a fact. I thought about the note. "Don't come home tomorrow." 4 words, no context, no name, and how I'd almost thrown it away. How I'd spent half a day convincing myself it was the confused impulse of an old man who'd meant to leave it somewhere else. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "When you put the note under my door, why not knock or write more?" He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid if I explained it fully and then nothing happened, you'd think I was a nosy old man who was making up problems. He looked at his mug. "Which is maybe what I am." "You're not," I said. He didn't respond to that, just turned the mug in his hands. I don't know exactly how long I sat there. The afternoon light shifted in that way it does in the south in October, going gold and then amber and then something close to copper before it fades. Pepper eventually walked over and sat on the porch step below us like she was presiding over the whole thing. I found out more details in the following days. The detective who called me, she was direct and thorough, and she spelled her last name twice without me asking, which I appreciated, told me that the man had been charged with stalking and violation of the restraining order. She said the previous tenant had a long history with him going back several years, had moved twice trying to get away from him, and that he'd tracked the address without realizing she no longer lived there. I was incidental, just the person who happened to be living in a house he'd convinced himself was still hers. That should have made me feel better. It didn't entirely. There's something disorienting about being in danger because of a story you didn't know you were in. I asked the detective if I needed to do anything. She said they'd keep me informed of the case status and that if I saw anything concerning in the meantime, to call immediately and reference the case number she gave me. I wrote it on a post-it and stuck it to my refrigerator. I also went to my landlord and asked about the previous tenant. I wasn't accusatory about it. He's a decent man and I genuinely don't think he believed he was putting me in any danger. But I wanted to know. He confirmed that the woman had lived there for about 14 months and had left somewhat suddenly, breaking the lease. He hadn't asked many questions. She'd forfeited her deposit, and that was that. He hadn't known about the restraining order. I believe him. He did offer to install a security camera. I took him up on it. I also got a deadbolt and a Ring doorbell. And I started parking in the garage instead of the driveway, which I'd stopped doing because the garage door was slow and annoying and I was always running late. I stopped caring about slow and annoying. The thing about that whole experience that I keep coming back to, the thing I still think about when I pull into my garage and hear the door grind shut behind me, isn't the fear. The fear was real, but it was clean, if that makes any sense. A straight line between a cause and a response. What I keep coming back to is how close I came to dismissing the one person who saw something was wrong. I'd looked at Clint, this retired schoolteacher with his wind chime and his baseball cap and his slow, careful way of speaking, and my brain had quietly filed him under, not a source of important information, not because he was unkind or unintelligent, just because he was old and quiet and not someone I'd ever thought of as someone who would save me from anything. That's the part that embarrasses me most, honestly. Not that I was scared, not that I didn't know someone was watching my house, that I'd spent 12 hours assuming a man's warning was less than it was because of who he was. I've thought about that a lot since then. A few weeks after everything happened, I brought Clint a pie. Nothing fancy. Just a store-bought apple pie in a box, because I'm not a great baker and I thought it would be worse to bring something homemade and terrible than to just be honest about my limitations. I left it on his porch with a note that said, "Thank you. I mean it." He knocked on my door that same evening, returned the empty pie tin. He'd eaten the whole thing, he said, which I found genuinely touching, and told me that his daughter had called him and told him he was a hero, and he'd found the whole thing uncomfortable. "I just noticed something," he said, standing in my doorway. "That's all." "I know," I said, "but noticing matters." He nodded once in that economical way of his and went back across the yard to his own porch. I stood in my doorway for a moment watching him go. Pepper wound around my ankles. The wind chime on his porch made its small, tinny music in the breeze, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't mind it at all. I stood at my kitchen trash can holding a 4-word note, and I almost let go of it. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the stalker, not the police tape, not even the weeks of someone sitting in a car watching my house without my knowledge. Just that 30-second moment over a trash can, where I almost decided that a quiet old man's warning wasn't worth keeping. We make those calculations all the time without realizing it. We sort people into categories: relevant, irrelevant, worth listening to, probably confused, and we do it so fast we don't even notice we're doing it. Clint didn't fit the category of person who saves you from something. He fit the category of neighbor who waves from the driveway and brings tomatoes in August. And so my brain, very efficiently, almost filed his warning under nothing. What stopped me wasn't wisdom. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't some deep instinct I've cultivated or a lesson I'd already learned. It was just a flicker of something I couldn't name, a small hesitation that didn't have a reason yet. I folded the note and put it in a drawer, and I went to bed. And I almost forgot about it, but Clint didn't almost forget. Clint had been watching and writing down license plates and making phone calls and sitting with the discomfort of not knowing whether he was right for 2 weeks. He didn't have certainty. He had observation and patience and the willingness to act on incomplete information because he decided that the cost of being wrong was lower than the cost of staying silent. That takes a kind of moral seriousness that I think we undervalue. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like a retired schoolteacher sitting on his porch with a mug, keeping track of things that don't concern him in any obvious way. The truth is, good judgment isn't always loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the accumulation of small, careful decisions, noticing, documenting, acting, following through, made by someone who has decided that paying attention to the world around them is worth the effort even when nothing comes of it. Clint had probably noticed dozens of things over the years that turned out to be nothing. He noticed this one too, and it happened to be something, and he acted anyway. I think about what would have happened if he hadn't. If he'd looked at that unfamiliar car and thought, "Not my business." If he'd talked himself out of the non-emergency call or decided the second call wasn't worth the trouble, the man in that car had an active restraining order. He'd followed a woman across 2 moves. He didn't know she was gone, and I didn't know any of it. There's a version of that story where I come home one ordinary evening and something happens that I am completely unprepared for because I had no idea I was living inside someone else's unresolved obsession. That version exists. It just didn't happen because one person decided that what he noticed mattered enough to act on, more than once, even without acknowledgement or thanks. I brought him a pie. It felt inadequate. It was inadequate. But I meant what I wrote on that note. I mean it. And I think he knew that. The wind chime is still there on his porch. I hear it on windy nights now, and I don't feel the mild irritation I used to feel. I feel something closer to gratitude. For someone who paid attention when it cost him nothing obvious, but could have cost him the comfortable fiction that things on his street were fine. For someone who did the right thing quietly, without an audience, without any guarantee it would matter. That kind of integrity doesn't make the news. It just keeps people safe.